Vienna in 1998 was a city where music lived in every corner. The grand concert halls stood like cathedrals, and the sound of classical piano drifted through open windows on warm evenings. In one of the most beautiful neighborhoods overlooking the city's historic center, there was a mansion that had witnessed decades of musical history. This was the home of Victor Brenner, a man whose name was spoken with reverence in every major concert hall from New York to Tokyo. At 67 years old, Victor had spent his entire life devoted to music. He'd conducted the greatest orchestras, performed on the world's most prestigious stages, and his interpretations of the classical masters were considered definitive. Critics called him a living legend. Other musicians spoke of him with a mixture of admiration and fear, for Victor's standards were impossibly high. But Victor lived alone now, surrounded by his instruments and his memories. His wife had passed away years ago, and he'd gradually withdrawn from public life. He still performed occasionally, still demanded perfection from every orchestra he conducted, but he'd stopped teaching. He'd grown tired of students who wanted fame more than they wanted music, tired of young pianists with technical skill but empty hearts. The mansion itself was like a museum. Priceless violins hung on walls. Ancient sheet music, some of it handwritten by composers long dead, filled glass cases. And in the center of Victor's private music room stood his most treasured possession, a Steinway grand piano worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Its black surface gleamed under the chandelier, and its keys had been touched by some of the greatest pianists in history. To maintain this grand house, Victor employed a small staff. Among them was Maria Castellanos, a woman who'd traveled halfway across the world to make a new life. Maria had come from the Philippines 3 years earlier, a widow at 39 with a young daughter to raise. Her husband's sudden death had left them with nothing, and the opportunity to work in Vienna, even as a housekeeper, seemed like a blessing. Maria worked harder than anyone Victor had ever employed. She understood what it meant to be grateful for an opportunity. Every morning before dawn, she was already moving through the mansion's rooms, ensuring everything met the maestro's exacting standards. She polished the same banister 3 times if needed. She learned which floors creaked and stepped carefully so as not to disturb Victor when he was working. She'd brought her daughter with her to Vienna. Elena was 14 now, caught between childhood and something more. She was a quiet girl, the kind who noticed everything but said little. While her mother worked, Elena spent most of her time in their small quarters on the mansion's 3rd floor. She read books from the local library, taught herself German from textbooks, and tried not to be a burden. Elena had learned early that their position was precarious. They lived in this beautiful place, but it wasn't theirs. They existed in the spaces between the maestro's life, careful never to intrude. She knew the rules without being told. Stay quiet, stay invisible, and never, ever touch anything that belonged to Victor Brenner. But rules, as Elena would discover, are sometimes made to be broken. It happened on a Tuesday evening in October. Victor had been working all day preparing for an upcoming concert in Berlin, and Maria believed he'd left for a dinner meeting with his manager. She was finishing her work in the kitchen when she realized she'd forgotten to dust the music room earlier. "Elena," she called up the stairs, "can you dust the music room quickly? The maestro is out, but do it fast and don't touch anything. Just dust and come right back." Elena climbed the wide marble staircase, her footsteps soft on the runner carpet. She'd been past the music room countless times, but had rarely been inside. When she pushed open the heavy door, the late afternoon sun was streaming through tall windows, painting everything in gold. And there, in the center of the room, was the piano. Elena had seen it before, of course, but always from the doorway, always in passing. Now alone in the golden light, she moved toward it as if pulled by invisible strings. She'd never seen anything so beautiful. The wood grain seemed to glow. The keys looked like they were carved from ivory and ebony by angels. She knew she shouldn't touch it. She knew it was worth more money than her mother would earn in 10 years. She knew the maestro guarded his instruments jealously, but something inside her chest was pulling tight, a longing she couldn't name. Back home in the Philippines, there'd been an old broken keyboard at their church. A kind priest named Father Miguel had shown her the basic notes once, and she'd spent hours picking out simple melodies on those damaged keys. She'd thought she'd forgotten all of it, but standing here now, her fingers remembered. Just one key, she thought, just to hear what a real piano sounds like. She touched middle C, and the sound that emerged made her breath catch. It wasn't just a note, it was alive, rich, resonating through the room and through her bones. Before she could stop herself, she was sitting on the bench. Her fingers found other keys. A simple melody came back to her, a folk song her father used to hum while working. She played it slowly, carefully, just the basic notes. She had no idea what she was doing technically, no understanding of proper hand position or dynamics. She just followed what felt right, what sounded beautiful. The music filled the empty room, and for the first time since coming to Vienna, Elena felt something like peace. She closed her eyes and let her fingers wander, finding harmonies by instinct, adding small embellishments to the melody. She had no idea that in the next room, Victor Brenner had been sitting at his desk the entire time. He'd been reviewing musical scores, so absorbed in his work that he hadn't heard Maria and Elena's conversation. When the music started, he assumed it was his assistant arriving early for their evening session. But something made him pause, pen hovering over the page. The playing was technically imperfect. He could hear that immediately with his trained ear. The tempo wavered. The transitions were clumsy, but there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was pure. Completely heartbreakingly pure. Victor had heard thousands of pianists in his lifetime. He'd judged competitions, auditioned students, worked with virtuosos who could play anything perfectly. But this simple melody, played by unknown hands, had a quality he hadn't heard in 20 years. Whoever was playing wasn't trying to impress anyone. They were simply loving the music. He stood slowly and moved toward the music room. Through the partially open door, he could see a girl sitting at his piano. A teenager in simple clothes, eyes closed, completely lost in what she was playing, and then he recognized her. The housekeeper's daughter. Victor stood frozen in the doorway, a dozen thoughts racing through his mind. This child had broken his most important rule. She was touching his most valuable instrument without permission. By all rights, he should be furious, but he couldn't look away from her hands, from the expression of complete peace on her face as she played. The melody came to a gentle end. Elena opened her eyes, and in that moment she saw him. The color drained from her face. She jumped up from the bench so fast she nearly knocked it over, her hands flying up as if to prove they were no longer touching anything they shouldn't. "I'm so sorry. Maestro Brenner," she said in German, the words tumbling out in panic. "I'm so sorry, I know I shouldn't have. I was just supposed to dust, and Please don't fire my mother. This was my fault, only mine." Victor raised one hand and she fell silent. He walked slowly into the room, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, revealing nothing. "Where?" he asked. "Did you learn to play?" Elena's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest. The maestro stood there waiting for an answer, his face unreadable. She'd seen him angry before, watched from hidden corners as he'd dismissed musicians from rehearsals for making mistakes. She'd heard stories from other staff members about his impossibly high standards. I didn't really learn, sir," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was a keyboard at our church back home. It was broken. Half the keys didn't work, but Father Miguel showed me the notes once. He taught me which keys made which sounds. After that, I watched videos sometimes at the library, free ones on the computers, but I never had lessons. We couldn't afford them." Victor studied her for a long moment. His expression gave nothing away. Then he walked past her to the piano and sat down on the bench. His fingers touched the keys, and suddenly the room filled with music so beautiful it made Elena want to cry. He played for perhaps 30 seconds, then stopped. "Do you know what that was?" he asked. Elena shook her head. "Chopin. Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the most beloved pieces in the piano repertoire." He stood up from the bench. "What you were playing when I walked in, where did that come from?" "It was just a song my father used to hum," Elena said, "when he was fixing things around the house. I don't know if it has a real name. I just remembered it and tried to find the notes." Something flickered in Victor's eyes, but Elena couldn't read it. He walked to a shelf lined with sheet music and pulled out a thick-bound volume. He carried it back to the piano and opened it to a specific page. "Come here," he said. Elena approached cautiously, like someone approaching a sleeping tiger. She looked at the page he was showing her. The musical notation was dense, complicated, filled with notes that seemed to climb and fall across the page like a mountain range. "This," Victor said, "is Ravel, Gaspard de la Nuit, specifically, the third movement called Scarbo. Do you know what professional pianists say about this piece? Elena shook her head again. They say it's one of the most technically difficult pieces ever written for piano. Some of the greatest pianists in the world spend years learning to play it properly. I was 23 when I first performed it in public, and I'd been training since I was 4 years old. He looked at her directly.
That's 19 years of practice before I was ready. Elena felt her stomach sink.
She didn't understand why he was telling her this. Victor closed the music book and held it out to her. I'm going to make you an offer. It's not a kind offer, and it's not because I'm a generous man. I'm making it because in 40 years of teaching, I've learned to recognize something rare when I see it. Elena took the book with trembling hands. You have 1 month, Victor said. Exactly 30 days. You will learn to play the first page of this piece, the first 32 measures. You will do this on your own time, after your mother finishes her work each day. You may use this piano for 1 hour each evening between 7 and 8 o'clock. During that hour, I will be working in another part of the house, and you will not disturb me. He paused, and his voice became harder. If you are late, the hour is forfeit. If you disturb your mother's work, the opportunity ends. If you damage my piano in any way, the opportunity ends. And if at the end of 30 days you cannot play those 32 measures, then you will never touch this piano again. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Elena whispered. Do not thank me, Victor said. This isn't a gift. This is a test. Most likely you'll fail. Most people do. He walked toward the door, then stopped. Your mother is in the kitchen. Go tell her what happened before she worries herself sick wondering why you're taking so long. After he left, Elena stood alone in the music room, holding the heavy book against her chest. Her hands were still shaking. She wasn't sure if what just happened was a miracle or a disaster. When she found her mother in the kitchen, Maria's face went pale as Elena explained everything. Oh, Elena, she said, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. You shouldn't have touched it. What were you thinking? I don't know, Mama, I'm sorry. Maria pulled back, holding Elena's shoulders. But he's giving you a chance? He's really letting you use his piano. I think so. But Mama, I can't do this. You should see this music. It's impossible. I don't even know how to read most of these symbols. Hush, Maria said, touching her daughter's cheek. You don't know what you can do until you try. Remember what your father always said? The only true failure is never beginning. That night, after their small dinner, Elena opened the Ravel book in their quarters and stared at the first page of Scarbo. The notes seemed to swim before her eyes. There were so many of them, moving so fast, jumping up and down the staff in ways that made no sense to her untrained mind. The next evening at 7 o'clock sharp, she sat at Victor's piano and began. The first few minutes were humiliating. She could barely figure out which notes to play, let alone play them in the right order at the right speed. Her fingers stumbled over each other. She hit wrong keys, lost her place, had to start over again and again. From somewhere deep in the house, Victor heard the halting, painful sounds of her practice. He smiled slightly to himself. This was exactly what he'd expected. The girl had natural musicality, but without training, without discipline, without years of building technique, she would never master something like Ravel. He'd given her an impossible task, and he knew it. But there was a reason. If she gave up quickly, then she'd never had the dedication required for music anyway. If she kept trying despite the difficulty, then perhaps, just perhaps, she was worth teaching. The days turned into weeks. Every evening at 7, Elena sat at the piano. She started going to the public library during her free time, finding recordings of Gaspard de la Nuit, listening to them over and over through the library's headphones. She discovered old videos of Victor himself performing the piece 20 years earlier. She watched his hands, tried to understand how he moved, how he shaped the phrases. At home, when she couldn't access the piano, she practiced the finger movements in the air, moving through the passages silently while lying in bed at night. Her mother would watch her, worried about the obsession she saw growing in her daughter's eyes, but also amazed at her determination. The piece was about a demon, she learned. A horrible little creature from French folklore that tormented a sleeping man. The music was supposed to sound frightening, chaotic, unpredictable. Understanding this helped her start to make sense of the wild notes, the sudden changes in volume and speed. But knowing what it should sound like and actually playing it were two completely different things. Her fingers ached constantly. There were nights she cried from frustration, certain she'd never get it right. The calendar on their wall seemed to move too fast, days disappearing while she still struggled with basic passages. Victor checked on her progress occasionally, standing in the hallway where she couldn't see him, just listening. After 2 weeks, she was still terrible. After 3 weeks, she'd managed to play through the first page, but it was slow, mechanical, full of mistakes. He shook his head. As he'd expected, the challenge was too great. Natural talent only took you so far. Without years of training, without understanding music theory, without the muscle memory that came from childhood practice, she simply couldn't bridge the gap. On the 28th day, with only 2 days left before the deadline, Elena sat at the piano with tears running down her face. She'd practiced the same 4 measures for an hour and still couldn't get them right. Her fingers wouldn't move fast enough. The leaps between notes were too big for her hands. "I can't do it, Mama," she said that night. "I've tried everything and I can't do it." Maria sat beside her daughter on the small bed they shared. "Then you can't," she said gently. "There's no shame in that, my love. You tried your best. That's all anyone can ask." "But I wanted it so much," Elena whispered. "I've never wanted anything this much in my whole life." "I know," Maria said, stroking her hair. "But maybe this isn't the end. Maybe it's just not the right time. You're only 14. There will be other chances, other opportunities." Elena nodded, but she didn't believe it. She knew what this was. Her one shot at something extraordinary, and she was going to fail. The next day, day 29, something changed. Elena sat at the piano for her evening hour. But instead of diving immediately into practice, she sat quietly for a moment. She thought about her father, about the song he used to hum. She thought about why she'd touched the piano in the first place. Not because she wanted to prove anything, but because the music called to her. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. But this time she stopped trying to play it perfectly. She stopped worrying about every single note being exactly right. Instead, she tried to play the feeling of it, the chaos, the fear, the demon dancing in the darkness. And suddenly, her fingers found pathways they'd been missing before. The music started to flow instead of stutter. It wasn't perfect, not even close, but it was alive. When her hour ended, she stood up from the piano with her heart racing. Tomorrow was day 30. Tomorrow, the maestro would judge whether she'd succeeded or failed. She had one more night to get it right. Elena barely slept that night. She lay in the darkness, her fingers moving through the passages over and over in her mind. Every note, every leap, every sudden shift in the music played behind her closed eyes. Her mother's gentle breathing beside her was the only sound in their small room, but Elena's head was full of demons and music. When morning came, she moved through her chores like a ghost. She helped her mother clean the breakfast room, dust the library, organize the linen closet. But her mind was somewhere else entirely, running through those 32 measures again and again. "You're very quiet today," Maria said as they folded sheets together in the afternoon. "I'm scared." "Mama," Elena admitted, "of the maestro, of disappointing him, of disappointing myself." She smoothed a wrinkle from the corner of a pillowcase. "What if I get so nervous that I forget everything? What if my hands shake too much?" Maria set down the sheet she was holding and took her daughter's hands in hers. "Listen to me. Tonight, when you sit at that piano, you remember something. You're not playing for Victor Brenner. You're playing for yourself, for that little girl who used to practice on a broken keyboard in a church because she loved the sounds it made. That's all this is. Just you and the music. Everything else is noise." At 6:30 that evening, Elena changed into the nicest clothes she owned. A simple navy dress that her mother had carefully pressed that morning. She brushed her hair until it shined. Her hands were trembling as she walked down the long hallway toward the music room. Victor was already there, sitting in a chair by the window. The evening light cast long shadows across the floor. He looked up when she entered but said nothing. He simply gestured toward the piano. Elena's legs felt weak as she crossed the room. She sat on the bench, adjusted her position, took a deep breath. The sheet music was already open to the first page of Scarbo, though by now she barely needed to look at it. She'd memorized every note. For a moment she just sat there, her hands hovering above the keys. She could feel Victor's eyes on her back, patient and watchful. The whole month came rushing back to her. The frustration, the tears, the moments she wanted to give up, the breakthrough she'd felt just yesterday. She thought about what her mother had said. Just you and the music. Elena placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The first measures emerged cleanly. Her fingers found their positions, moved through the opening phrases with more confidence than she'd expected. The nervous energy that had been building all day transformed into focus. She let the music carry her forward. But then, 8 measures in, she hit a passage she'd struggled with for weeks. Her left hand had to leap across the keyboard while her right hand maintained a rapid sequence of notes. In practice, she'd stumbled here 1,000 times. Her heart hammered. For a split second, she felt panic rising. But then she remembered something she'd noticed in one of Victor's old performance videos. The way he seemed to trust his hands, to let them move without overthinking. She forced herself to do the same. The leap worked. Her left hand found the right notes and she was through the difficult passage. 16 measures. Halfway there, the demon in the music began to come alive under her fingers. She could feel it. Now that chaotic, frightening energy that Ravel had written into every phrase. Her hands moved faster, growing bolder. A phrase that had felt impossible 2 days ago now flowed naturally. 20 measures. Then 25. The final section approached, the part where the demon's dance reached its peak. Her fingers flew across the keys, the volume building, the intensity growing. She could feel sweat on her forehead but didn't dare lose focus. And then suddenly she was playing the final measure. The last chord rang out, harsh and unresolved, exactly as Ravel had written it. The sound hung in the air for a moment before fading into silence. Elena sat frozen, her hands still resting on the keys, her heart racing. She'd done it. She'd actually played through the entire page without stopping. There had been small imperfections, she knew that. A note slightly off here, a rhythm not quite exact there, but she'd made it through. Behind her, Victor said nothing. The silence stretched out, becoming unbearable. Elena's brief moment of triumph began to crumble into doubt. Maybe it hadn't been good enough. Maybe the mistakes were worse than she thought. Maybe... Stand up, Victor said. Elena stood on shaking legs and turned to face him. His expression was as unreadable as ever, his eyes sharp and analytical. He rose from his chair and walked toward her slowly, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room. Your hand position is terrible, he said. Your posture needs complete correction. Your pedal work is inconsistent. You rushed through measures 18 and 19, and you were slightly flat on the D in measure 23. Elena felt her eyes begin to sting. She'd failed after all, but Victor wasn't finished. However, he continued, and something subtle shifted in his voice. You understood the character of the piece. You captured the essence of what Ravel was trying to express. And most importantly, you didn't give up when you reached the difficult passages. You pushed through. He paused, studying her face. That was adequate. Elena blinked, confused. Adequate didn't sound like praise. Adequate, Victor repeated, is far more than I expected from someone with no formal training attempting one of the most difficult pieces in the piano repertoire after only 30 days. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close. It's also far more than most of my former students could have achieved under the same circumstances. Elena's breath caught. Does that mean? It means we'll begin proper lessons tomorrow, Victor said. 7 o'clock in the evening, just as before. But understand this. What you've done over the past month was nothing compared to what real training requires. You'll work harder than you've ever worked in your life. You'll want to quit 100 times. I'll push you beyond what you think you're capable of, and I'll accept nothing less than your complete dedication. He walked to a cabinet and pulled out several books of sheet music, stacking them in her arms. Start with these. Basic technique, scales, fundamental theory. You need to build a proper foundation before we go any further. Elena looked down at the books, then back up at Victor. Why? She asked quietly. Why are you doing this for me? For a moment, something sad and distant passed across Victor's face. Because 40 years ago, someone took a chance on an angry young man who had talent but no discipline. That teacher saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. He turned away, looking out the window at the Vienna evening. And because, in all my years of teaching, I've rarely met anyone who wanted music as much as you clearly do. Talent alone is common. Dedication is common. But both together with that kind of hunger? That's rare. Elena felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. Tomorrow, Victor said dismissively, in a tone that meant the conversation was over. 7 o'clock, don't be late. Elena clutched the books to her chest and practically ran from the room. She found her mother in the kitchen, still cleaning up from dinner. The moment Maria saw her daughter's face, she knew. He said yes? Maria whispered. Elena nodded, unable to speak, and her mother wrapped her in a tight embrace. They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other, both crying now. Maria had left everything she knew in the Philippines, hoping to give her daughter a better life. But she'd never imagined anything like this. The months that followed were the hardest of Elena's life. Victor hadn't been exaggerating about the difficulty. He was a demanding teacher, sometimes harsh, always exacting. He made her practice scales for hours until her fingers ached. He corrected her posture dozens of times each session. When she made mistakes, he made her repeat passages until they were perfect, but he also taught her things she'd never dreamed of understanding. Music theory that revealed why certain notes sounded beautiful together. The history behind the pieces she played. The emotions and stories that composers had woven into their work. Elena absorbed it all like a plant that had been dying of thirst, suddenly given water. She practiced every spare moment she had. After her evening lessons with Victor, she'd go back to her room and study the theory books he'd given her. She learned to read music as naturally as reading words on a page. Her mother watched the transformation with wonder and occasional worry. Elena was growing up so fast, becoming so focused. Sometimes Maria missed the carefree girl who used to read novels and daydream. But she also saw the light in her daughter's eyes, the sense of purpose that drove her forward. 6 months into the lessons, something began to change in Vienna's classical music community. Victor had friends and colleagues throughout the city, other musicians and conductors and teachers. Occasionally one would visit the house for dinner or drinks, and occasionally they would hear piano music drifting from the music room. "Who's that playing?" they would ask. "A student," Victor would answer, revealing nothing more. But the music itself revealed plenty. Even from another room, even through closed doors, these trained ears could hear something special. The playing was still developing, still imperfect in many ways, but there was a quality to it that made people stop and listen. Rumors began to circulate. The great Maestro Brenner, who hadn't taken a student in over 5 years, was teaching again. But who? No one seemed to know. One evening, Professor Anton Weber from the Vienna Conservatory stopped by for a visit. He was an old friend of Victor's, a brilliant violinist and teacher. As they sat in Victor's study discussing an upcoming concert, the sound of piano music floated through the house. Anton's head turned immediately. "Is that?" He listened for a moment. "Victor, is that the Chopin Ballade No. 1? "The second ballade," Victor corrected. "Who on earth is playing it?" Victor took a sip of his wine. "My student." "I didn't know you'd started teaching again." Anton leaned forward, intrigued. "How long has this person been studying?" 8 months. Anton's eyebrows shot up. 8 months? Victor, that piece typically requires years of advanced study. Who is this prodigy you've been hiding? Victor smiled slightly. "Patience, Anton. When she's ready, the world will meet her. But not before." In the music room, unaware of the conversation happening down the hall, Elena worked through the difficult middle section of the Chopin piece, her fingers moving across the keys with growing confidence. She had no idea that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. 18 months had passed since that October evening when Elena first touched Victor's piano. She was 16 now, and the shy, uncertain girl who'd arrived in Vienna had transformed into something else entirely. She moved with more confidence, spoke with more clarity, and when she sat at the piano, something almost magical happened. But Victor knew that talent hidden away in a private music room meant nothing. Real musicians had to face audiences, had To feel the weight of expectation, had to learn to perform under pressure. It was time for Elena to step out of the shadows. One evening after their lesson, Victor asked Elena and her mother to stay. They sat in his study, surrounded by photographs of concerts and awards from decades past. Maria perched nervously on the edge of an antique chair while Elena sat beside her, confused about why they'd been summoned. "In 6 weeks," Victor said, "I'm organizing a private concert. A small gathering of about 50 people, conductors, composers, conservatory directors, music critics, some of the most knowledgeable classical music minds in Europe." He looked directly at Elena. "You'll be the performer." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "Me? But I'm not ready for—" "I'll decide when you're ready," Victor interrupted. "And I say you are. You'll perform the complete Gaspard de la Nuit. All 3 movements, approximately 25 minutes of music." Maria's hand found her daughter's and squeezed tight. "Maestro, forgive me, but isn't this too soon? Elena has only been training for a year and a half. These people you're inviting, they'll have such high expectations. They'll expect nothing because they don't know who's performing," Victor said. "I've told no one about Elena. The invitations simply promise an evening of revel performed by a new artist." He leaned back in his chair. "This is how it must be done. If I announce that I'm presenting my student, everyone will come with judgments already formed. They'll see her age, her background, and they'll have decided what to think before she plays a single note. This way they'll have nothing to judge except the music itself." Elena's mind was racing. The complete Gaspard de la Nuit. The piece that had started everything. She'd mastered that first page over a month of desperate practice. Since then, she'd learned the entire work, all 3 movements. But performing it for an audience, especially an audience of experts, was something entirely different. "What if I fail?" she asked quietly. "Then you fail," Victor said not unkindly, "and you'll learn from it and do better next time." "But I don't believe you'll fail. I've watched you work, Elena. I've seen how you approach difficult passages, how you connect with the emotional core of the music. You have something these people need to hear." Over the next 6 weeks, Elena worked harder than ever before. Every day after helping her mother with the morning chores, she practiced. Every evening she had her lesson with Victor, and then she practiced more. The 3 movements of Gaspard de la Nuit became part of her bones, her breath, her dreams. Ondine, the first movement, told the story of a water nymph trying to seduce a man into her underwater kingdom. The music rippled and flowed like water, beautiful but dangerous. Elena learned to make the piano sing like waves, to capture that sense of something lovely that could pull you under and drown you. Le Gibet, the second movement, was darker. It depicted a corpse hanging from a gallows, swaying in the wind while a bell tolled in the distance. Victor taught her to find the horror in beauty, to make simple, repeated notes sound like doom approaching slowly but inevitably. And Scarbo, the demon movement that had started her journey, was now something she could play with real mastery. The chaos, the terror, the mad dance of a creature from nightmares. It all lived in her fingers now. But knowing the notes was only part of performing. Victor began to teach her about stage presence, about how to walk onto a platform, how to acknowledge an audience, how to handle the silence before the first note and after the last. "The performance begins the moment they see you," he told her, "and it doesn't end until you leave the stage. Everything you do communicates something to the audience." 3 days before the concert, Maria used money she'd been saving for over a year to buy Elena a dress. It was simple, elegant black, appropriate for a classical performance. When Elena tried it on, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. She looked older, more sophisticated, like a real pianist. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, terror and excitement warring inside her chest. In 3 days, some of the most important people in classical music would be listening to her play. People who could open doors or close them forever. People who'd heard the greatest pianists in the world. What if her fingers froze? What if she forgot a passage? What if they laughed at her? "I can hear you thinking from here," Maria whispered in the darkness. "Talk to me, my love." "What if I embarrass Victor?" Elena said. "He's put his reputation on the line for me. If I fail, it reflects on him. Victor Brenner wouldn't be doing this if he didn't believe in you," Maria said. "That man doesn't do anything he doesn't want to do. Trust him, and more importantly, trust yourself." The evening of the concert arrived faster than Elena wanted. The venue was a historic salon that had hosted performances for over 200 years. The walls were covered in gold leaf, and crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the small stage. 50 chairs were arranged in neat rows, and as evening fell, they filled with some of the most distinguished names in Vienna's music world. Professor Weber was there, along with directors from 3 major conservatories. There were conductors who'd led orchestras around the world, composers whose works were performed in every major concert hall, and critics whose reviews could make or break careers. They murmured among themselves, curious about this mysterious performer Victor had promised them. Some had theories, perhaps a student from Moscow or a young talent from Asia where so many prodigies emerged. Others thought maybe Victor had convinced an established pianist to perform under a pseudonym. Backstage, in a small room with a mirror and a piano for warming up, Elena tried to control her breathing. Her hands were shaking. Her mother stood beside her, one hand resting on her shoulder. "Remember what I told you the night of your test," Maria said softly. "You're not playing for them. You're playing for yourself, for the music. Everything else is just noise." Victor appeared in the doorway. He looked at Elena for a long moment, then nodded once. "It's time." Elena stood, smoothed her dress, and followed him toward the stage. She could hear the audience on the other side of the curtain, their conversations dying down as they sensed the performance was about to begin. Victor walked out first. The audience quieted immediately, showing the respect his presence commanded. "Good evening," he said simply. "Tonight you'll hear Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit, performed by an artist I've been working with. I ask only that you listen with open minds and hearts. The music will speak for itself." He gestured toward the wings, and Elena walked onto the stage. The reaction was immediate. Whispers rippled through the audience. She was so young. And wasn't that Victor's housekeeper's daughter? What was this? Some kind of charity gesture? A publicity stunt? One of the critics, a man named Franz Richter, known for his harsh reviews, leaned toward his companion and muttered, "Victor has finally lost his mind." Elena heard none of this. She'd trained herself to block everything out except the piano. She walked to the bench, sat down, adjusted her position exactly as Victor had taught her. The audience noise faded to silence. She placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes for just a moment. She thought about the first time she'd touched this kind of piano, about the joy that had flooded through her. She thought about every hour of practice, every correction from Victor, every moment of frustration and breakthrough. She thought about her father, who'd believed she could do anything, and her mother, sitting somewhere in the back of this room, believing in her still. Elena opened her eyes and began to play Ondine. Within seconds, the skepticism in the room evaporated. The water nymph song flowed from Elena's fingers with such clarity, such beauty, that every person there forgot to breathe. The notes rippled and cascaded, seductive and dangerous, exactly as Ravel had imagined them. Professor Weber sat forward in his chair, his eyes wide. This wasn't just good. This was extraordinary. Elena moved through the movement with complete confidence. When the final notes of Ondine faded away, there was absolute silence for a moment. Then, breaking with classical concert tradition, someone began to applaud between movements. Others joined in, unable to contain themselves, but Elena didn't hear them. She was already in the world of Le Gibet, that dark place where death hung in the air. The repeated note, like a bell tolling, rang out under her right hand while her left hand painted the dark landscape. The horror of it, the inevitability of it filled the room. Franz Richter, the harsh critic, felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years of attending concerts, genuine emotion stirred by a performance. His eyes were actually stinging, and then Scarbo began. The demon erupted from Elena's fingers in all its chaotic glory. Her hands flew across the keyboard, the music building in intensity, the creature dancing and leaping and terrorizing. The technical difficulty that made professional pianists nervous was there in every measure. But Elena played through it as if possessed by the demon herself. The final section approached, the climax where everything came together in a frenzy of notes. Elena's entire body was engaged now, swaying slightly, her face showing the concentration and passion flowing through her. Sweat glistened on her forehead, and then the final crashing chords. The demon's dance ended abruptly, violently, leaving only echoes. Elena's hands lifted from the keys. The last note faded into silence. For 5 full seconds, nobody moved. The audience sat frozen, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Then the room exploded. Everyone was on their feet, applauding with a fervor rarely seen at classical concerts. Professor Weber was applauding so hard his hands hurt. Franz Richter had tears streaming openly down his face, not even bothering to hide them. Elena stood and bowed, and the applause grew even louder. In the back of the room, Maria was crying, her hands clasped over her mouth, and near the stage, Victor stood watching his student receive her ovation, and on his face was an expression no one there had seen in years. He was smiling. The moment Elena left the stage, she was surrounded. Professor Weber reached her first, his face flushed with excitement. "You must study at the conservatory," he said, gripping her hand. "Full scholarship. I'll arrange everything personally. We need to begin immediately." 2 other conservatory directors pushed forward with similar offers. A concert promoter wanted to book her for a tour. A man from a recording label was already pulling out his business card. Everyone was talking at once, their voices overlapping in a confusion of opportunities and demands. Elena stood frozen in the center of it all, overwhelmed. The performance had left her emotionally drained, and now this flood of attention was more than she could process. Her eyes searched the crowd frantically until she found her mother pushing through the throng toward her. Then Victor's voice cut through the chaos. "Gentlemen, ladies, please." He didn't shout, but something in his tone made everyone fall silent. "Elena has just completed a demanding performance. She needs time to rest, and you need time to think clearly, rather than making promises in the heat of the moment." He placed himself between Elena and the crowd. "Those who wish to discuss her musical future seriously may contact me tomorrow. Tonight we celebrate what we've witnessed, not what we want from it." The crowd reluctantly stepped back, though the excitement didn't fade from their faces. They returned to the main salon where wine and refreshments had been set out. But the conversation was all about the mysterious young pianist who'd appeared from nowhere. Franz Richter, the critic, approached Victor quietly. "In 30 years of reviewing performances, I've never felt what I felt tonight," he said. "That girl has something I can't even name. Where has she been hiding?" "She hasn't been hiding," Victor replied. "She's been learning. There's a difference." In a quiet corner, Elena sat with her mother, still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. "Mama, did that really just happen?" she whispered. Maria laughed, wiping tears from her own eyes. "It happened, my love. You were magnificent." Over the next few days, Victor's phone rang constantly. Offers poured in from around the world. But Victor was careful. He'd seen too many young talents destroyed by early fame, pushed into the spotlight before they were ready, burned out before they'd fully developed. He turned down most of the offers without even telling Elena about them. What he did accept was Professor Weber's offer from the Vienna Conservatory. Elena would study there while continuing her private lessons with Victor. She'd be exposed to other teachers, other perspectives, other students, but she wouldn't be thrust into the commercial machinery of classical music. Not yet. Elena threw herself into her conservatory studies with the same intensity she brought to everything. The other students were mostly her age or older, many from wealthy families who'd been training since early childhood. At first, some looked down on her, the maid's daughter who'd gotten lucky. But the first time they heard her play, the whispers stopped. 3 years passed. Elena grew from a talented teenager into a mature artist. She performed occasionally at conservatory recitals, at small concerts around Vienna, building her repertoire and her confidence. But Victor kept her largely out of the public eye, letting her develop without pressure. Then, shortly after Elena's 19th birthday, Victor made an announcement. Elena would make her professional debut at the Musikverein, one of the world's most prestigious concert halls. She would perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, one of the most demanding concertos ever written, accompanied by the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra, and Victor himself would conduct. This was extraordinary news. Victor had barely conducted in the past 5 years. For him to return to the podium for Elena's debut was a statement that shocked the classical music world. Tickets sold out within hours. International media requested credentials. Everyone wanted to witness this event. The months of preparation were intense. Elena had to learn to play with an orchestra, to follow a conductor's tempo, to blend her individual voice with 100 other musicians. There were rehearsals where she struggled, where nothing seemed to work, where she wondered if she was truly ready for this. But Victor was patient. In private lessons, he reminded her why they'd chosen this particular concerto. Rachmaninoff was a pianist himself, he explained. He understood what the instrument could do, what it could express. This concerto isn't just technically difficult, it's emotionally deep. It's about longing, about beauty and sadness intertwined. You understand these things, Elena. Play what you know. Maria watched her daughter disappear into the music during those months. Sometimes she worried. Elena was only 19, still so young, and the pressure was immense. But she also saw something beautiful. Her daughter had found her purpose, the thing she was meant to do in this world. The night of the debut arrived. The Music Verine's Golden Hall was filled to capacity. Nearly 2,000 people filled the seats, and the air buzzed with anticipation. In the audience were music critics from major newspapers around the world, classical music enthusiasts who'd traveled from other countries, and many of the same people who'd attended that private concert 3 years earlier. Backstage, Elena stood in a quiet room wearing an elegant blue gown that had been a gift from Victor. Her mother had helped her with her hair, pulling it back simply so it wouldn't interfere with her playing. "You remember the first time you touched that piano?" Maria asked, adjusting a strand of her daughter's hair. "You were so scared when the maestro found you." "I thought my life was over," Elena said with a small smile. "Instead, it was just beginning." Maria kissed her daughter's forehead. "Your father would be so proud. I wish he could see this." "He can," Elena said softly. "I know he can." Victor appeared at the door. He was dressed in his formal conducting attire, and he looked every bit the legendary maestro he was. "The orchestra is ready," he said. "Are you?" Elena took a deep breath and nodded. They walked together toward the stage. Elena could hear the murmur of the audience, that particular sound of thousands of people waiting for something to begin. Victor squeezed her shoulder once, then walked out onto the stage to applause. He took his position on the podium, raised his baton, and nodded to the concertmaster. Then Elena walked out. The applause was immediate and warm. She'd become known in Vienna over the past 3 years, and people were genuinely excited to see her perform. She walked to the piano, bowed to the audience, then sat at the bench. She looked up at Victor on his podium. He was watching her, his baton raised, waiting for her signal that she was ready. Their eyes met, and in that moment so much passed between them without words. Everything they'd worked for, everything she'd learned, every hour of practice and correction and breakthrough, it all led to this moment. Elena nodded slightly. Victor's baton came down, and the orchestra began. The opening notes of the Rachmaninoff concerto were played by the orchestra alone, a powerful, sweeping melody that set the emotional tone. Then Elena's moment arrived. Her hands came down on the keys, and her first notes soared over the orchestra. What happened over the next 40 minutes was something that people who were there would talk about for the rest of their lives. Elena didn't just play the concerto, she lived inside it. Every phrase had meaning, every passage told a story. The technical demands that made this concerto feared by pianists worldwide seemed almost effortless for her. But more than that, she captured the soul of the music. In the slow movement, people in the audience wept openly. The melody was so beautiful, so full of longing, and Elena played it as if she were pouring her heart out through the keys. Victor conducted with tears in his own eyes, something no one there had ever seen. The final movement built to an explosive conclusion, Elena's fingers flying across the keyboard while the orchestra swelled around her. The final chords crashed out, powerful and triumphant, and then silence fell. For a moment, nothing. Then the audience erupted. People were on their feet instantly, applauding, shouting, some crying. The ovation went on for over 10 minutes. Elena bowed again and again. Victor came down from the podium and embraced her publicly, another thing no one had ever seen him do. The reviews the next day were unanimous. The New York Times called it a performance that reminded us why classical music still matters. Critics struggled to find words adequate to describe what they'd witnessed. Words like transcendent, historic, and once in a generation appeared in every review. 5 years later, at 24, Elena had performed in concert halls on every continent. She'd recorded albums that won international awards. She'd become one of the most celebrated pianists of her generation. But success hadn't changed the core of who she was. She still called Victor weekly, still asked his advice, still considered him the most important person in her musical life. And when she returned to Vienna between tours, she always visited him at the mansion where it all began. On one such visit, Victor was 82 now, and his health was declining. He didn't conduct anymore, rarely left the house. But his mind was still sharp, and he still loved to hear Elena play. She played for him in the music room, just the two of them, performing the same Chopin nocturne he'd played for her that first evening, when he'd given her the impossible test. When she finished, he smiled. "You've exceeded every hope I had for you," he said quietly. "And I had very high hopes." "You gave me everything," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saw something in a girl who had no right to touch your piano." "No," Victor corrected gently. "I saw something in a girl who loved music so much she couldn't help but touch it. That's different. The gift was always yours, Elena. I just helped you understand what you already had." 2 years later, Victor passed away peacefully in his sleep. In his will, he left his personal Steinway grand piano, the same one where Elena had first played, to her. It was his most valuable possession, and his note with the bequest was simple: "This piano found its true voice with you." The story concludes 10 years after that debut concert. Elena, now in her 30s, stands on stage at the Cultural Center of the Philippines in Manila. It's a special homecoming concert, and the audience is filled with people from her mother's homeland. Maria sits in the front row, retired now and comfortable, but still the same humble woman who'd worked as a housekeeper in Vienna. Beside her are students from the foundation Elena established, an organization that provides free music education and instruments to children who couldn't otherwise afford them. After her performance, Elena does something unexpected. She brings a young boy onto the stage, a 10-year-old she'd discovered playing on a public piano in a Manila park. His name is Carlos, and he's the son of a janitor. She'd heard something in his playing, that same spark she'd once had. "This is what music is really for," Elena tells the audience. "Not for glory or fame, but for passing something beautiful forward. Someone once took a chance on a girl who shouldn't have touched his piano. Now it's my turn to take chances on others." The audience applauds as Elena sits beside Carlos at the piano, showing him a simple technique, encouraging him the way Victor once encouraged her. In the audience, Maria closes her eyes and smiles, remembering that small room in Vienna where it all began, remembering her daughter's trembling hands the first time she'd attempted the impossible, and somewhere perhaps Victor is smiling too.